Thank you, Katja, and welcome everybody. Just to get a sense of it, who's in the room, can I have a show of hands of who works, for example, for international NGOs here in the room? Okay, quite a large number. Interesting. So what about grassroots organizations? Does anybody self-identify with grassroots? So a lot of the thank you, John. Take on. Do we have any representatives of the government, the ministry, for example, in the room? Great that you could make it. Anything that I haven't put forward as a possible identity? Interested public, students, researchers? Student researchers, consultants? Yeah, one consultant. Do we have a share of the profit after this when you share the expertise? No, I'm kidding. So thank you everybody in the room, and like Katja already said, a huge welcome to the guests. And I'm just going to say a few words about who the guests are. I think in coming to the program, you've already recognized their value, and therefore that is also a big reason why you want to come. Jill Nicholson is with us, and she's sitting right at the front. Will be coming up in a moment. Is a strategic partnership advisor for the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, based in the UK, in London, I understand, and very much involved also with advising on organizational development, learning trajectories, learning journeys in humanitarian action. So welcome, thank you for making it, Jill. And Zegan Ali, I think this is a name that I don't have to introduce, and everybody has come here for, and very strongly also. Zegan Ali, Executive Director of Adesso, Southern NGO, I think in the Grand Bargain terminology, isn't it? Regional programming in Somalia, in Kenya, and very strong advocate of the localization agenda, if not founder of the localization agenda as it is now, and also leadership council member of the NEAR network, so a very strong networking focus of local and national organizations in humanitarian action. We also have John Ruot. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Yeah, and he's the executive director from a Ugandan refugee-led organization, the Youth Social Advocacy Team. So I think that's really interesting, increasingly in research and in the localization-related debate. We want to learn from and with what are refugee-led organizations doing, organizations that emerge from the communities themselves, the affected communities themselves, and how they see the agenda and the support that should be provided by the system to their work. We also have Petra Ligeti, a colleague of mine from Oxfam, based at Oxfam Novib in the Netherlands, so the Dutch affiliate of Oxfam. And she's the program manager for the Elna project. You may have come across it before. It stands for Empowering Local and National Humanitarian Actors, and is implemented in Uganda and Bangladesh. I'm sure you'll talk more about it later, but welcome, Petra. And then we also have Abdirizak, the ED, thank you, the Executive Director of TAS, the Tadamon Social Society in Somalia. And he'll also be joining in the last session, specifically that will focus much more on Somalia, the reality of localization in Somalia, together with a guest who will be joining virtually, and perhaps we'll find out how exactly. And I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this name, so apologies already, but I think it's Maticia Kovac, the head of the Somalia Humanitarian Fund. So fantastic to have such a diverse array of speakers to help inform our dialogue. Now, one thing that I wanted to do, you have the agenda. Oh, sorry, there were slides for everybody. Sorry, guys. This is the agenda and how we propose to do the day today. There's one thing that I would like to propose to the audience, because there's a lot of presentations and contributions, but what I would love to do is to see if we can speed up the presentations a little bit and then really open up to participatory kind of engagement on the issues. So what I would like to do is to kind of bring these 4 presentations into one go. I know that's a long sit, but then also to really go through them quite quickly and then really open up into conversations amongst yourselves, or what are the questions that you really want to put forward to the speakers in more of a talk show kind of format. And then really have enough time for that kind of talk show between the speakers and the questions that you brought forward. So rather than having a one question, one answer, having it more in a participatory style, then going for the break, and then going for the last session. So if that's okay with the speakers and the audience, then that's how I would like to propose that we do it. So for the first set of speakers then, I would like to ask Jill and Degan to join me. So maybe Jill first, sorry, if that's okay. If you want to join me, Jill. And if all is well, your presentation.
Where would you like me?
Here, yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. It's lovely to see so many people turning out to discuss this very important issue. So at the Academy, we recognise that humanitarian crises are becoming more frequent, complex and widespread. There are not enough experienced people or resources to respond quickly and effectively, and this is why we believe learning saves lives. So we recognise that there is a power imbalance when it comes to capacity strengthening, and one question we're routinely challenging ourselves with is relevance, and critically reflecting, can an international organisation based in London actually deliver on this? We're certainly not the only ones thinking about this, which is lovely to hear, and certainly obviously there's a plethora of reports, working groups and conferences. The meeting that's happening in Brussels has been spoken about already. There was the WAP localisation roundtable last week, and Elna, all discussing the theme of relevance, and many individuals coming together to discuss these issues. So this is a priority area for many organisations. However, it still remains that currently capacity is largely dictated by international agencies, as it's regularly delivered through contractual top-down partnerships rather than through genuine collaborations. So capacity is often viewed through a risk lens, which can intrinsically be linked to compliance and therefore organisational capacity for systems, processes and policies, and intertwined with access to funding rather than operational capacity and the contribution of organisations in actually alleviating suffering, particularly within a humanitarian setting. So there's often an assumption that local and national actors do not have capacity, and such assumptions can often become embedded and institutionalized with organizations, resulting in international actors determining which organizations need capacity and in what. This is predominantly therefore a one-sided conversation where local actors do not always have mechanisms in which to share their needs and have those recognized. So not only are local and national organizations not necessarily engaged, is that all right? Not necessarily engaged in a two-way conversation about their needs. Two-way sharing is certainly underutilized, and more credence and recognition needs to be given to the notion that capacity does not necessarily just flow one way from international to local. So as well as only as well as only addressing perceived needs, this approach to capacity strengthening can result in duplicity of initiatives. So due to a lack of transferability and recognition, as well as funding and time of those engaged in these particular approaches. This is particularly prevalent, we feel, in the compliance setting, as these are certainly not standardized across institutions. So moreover, the approach to capacity strengthening often focuses on capacitating individuals rather than looking at an organizational lens. This has connotations in terms of sustainability of initiatives. Get business. For this one. There we go. Oh, sorry. There you go.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No worries. Yeah, could have got them online. And so without looking at a sort of an organizational focus, it's very challenging for organizations to actually implement these within structures. Therefore, where there is value in strengthening individual capacity, often it doesn't get implemented or fully embedded. And there's a number of challenges around that, particularly in terms of transferability of humanitarian actors. Often they turn over within the field. Also the funding situation, so where projects end, but also in a sense of activities not going on beyond a short-term intervention.
So we're also increasingly seeing incidences of protracted crisis within the humanitarian sector. And according to OCHA, the average length of a humanitarian crisis is now more than 9 years. So specifically for the humanitarian sector, capacity strengthening can be deprioritized as actors balance immediate life-saving interventions rather than thinking about planned capacity strengthening activities when they first hit the ground. So as a result, we feel that the assumption is that capacity strengthening is not always best placed within a humanitarian setting. However, through our own experience, 43% of our learners on Kaya, which is our learning management platform for those of you who are not aware, are from countries suffering from a severe humanitarian crisis or hosting a large population of refugees. We see countries such as Yemen, Syria, Iraq and Bangladesh making up a high proportion of our overall learners, all actually falling in with our top 10 user base, therefore demonstrating to us that actually during crisis there is a desire for access to learning opportunities and therefore challenging that viewpoint. Considering the challenging situations in which humanitarian organisations operate, alongside the complex and protracted nature of crisis, this could now be where the nexus between development and humanitarian comes further into play, and how we can look at to continue to invest and stay relevant in these ever-changing landscapes. So at the Academy, I'll tell you a little bit about us. So it's probably worth saying that the Academy is, the Humanitarian Leadership Academy is actually part of Save the Children, and as Saskia mentioned, I'm based within the UK. So we sit within their humanitarian team and we work most closely with the humanitarian capacity building team there. We have our own mission though, and our mission is to enable people to prepare for and respond to crises in their own communities. So one of the ways in which we seek to achieve this is by improving accessibility, quality, scale and sustainability of learning for the sector. So although we're based within Save the Children, we have a sector-wide mandate, which is what we've always had from previously being independent of Save the Children. So we want to change the way that capacity strengthening is approached in the sector by enabling local and national actors to be able to identify their own learning needs and access content which is relevant to them. So we seek to, it's a bit of a buzzword, democratise access to learning through the creation of a marketplace, utilising a network of partners who make content as relevant as possible through translation and contextualisation. Currently, Kaya hosts over 400 freely available courses, and we have a learner base of 120,000 individuals from 190 different countries. So a huge diversity of people accessing our resources and lots of people feeding back to us on what they would like to see more of on Kaya. We do recognise there are significant challenges, and this is a very complicated issue, and an inherent question comes back to, which was already pointed out, some of the terminology alone. So we have capacity building, capacity strengthening, capacity sharing, capacity bridging, which is a new one that I picked up at Elna last week, training and or learning. And many of these come with connotations that perpetuate this power imbalance between actors and can inadvertently seek to disempower particularly local and national actors, as it can imply, or disregard any existing capacities as well as their locally determined needs. So one example of a project where we are exploring how NGOs and local actors can work together to identify an approach to strengthen and build their capacities is being undertaken with Save the Children Denmark and hosted by the South Sudan NGO Forum in Juba. So the objective of the project, which is called Strengthening Effective Humanitarian Partnerships, is to support local and national humanitarian actors to have increased capacity to respond more effectively and efficiently in line with humanitarian principles and to exert greater influence in the humanitarian coordination. So essentially the main output is a locally owned learning platform of organisational and individual staff capacity strengthening, which is as independent as possible to the interests of international actors. So the way that we do this is we undertake a sort of a learning assessment to see how their organisation systems and processes can actually prevent or support effective learning. We look at how this affects individuals within that organisation, and then working with the organisations, we build out a capacity framework to be able to support them moving forward and build out learning based on this. So in this instance, the project is reaching 15 organisations in year one and has a locally employed coordinator. And we're hoping to scale up to more organisations in year two by cascading locally generated learning further. I think one of the key things I really wanted to highlight about this project, other than just the structure itself, was it's really shown us the need for flexibility within projects. So the local coordinator, who's called Charles, was given the freedom and autonomy to really shape this project, and he actually quite heavily pushed back on some aspects of it, particularly some of the methodology. This has shown us this acute need for flexibility and really challenged us as an organisation to think how comfortable we were with that, in terms of we provided what we considered best placed framework, and then they've done something slightly different with us. And for us, we were actually very comfortable with this. This is the core of localization, exactly what we wanted to see, giving these organizations the freedom to actually generate their own solutions within this given framework. Although we recognise this project's happening in a very small way, it is something we're hoping to expand on in the future, and currently looking to take this model to Yemen. So very quickly then, looking to the future, there is need for a systematic change in the way that capacity strengthening is predominantly being approached. And I think one of the key things in that is how we look at identifying the needs of local and national actors and the methodologies that are being deployed to deliver capacity strengthening activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jill. I'm sorry for the rush. I don't know if you're familiar with the Pecha Kucha format, where it's 6 minutes for 60 seconds. 60 seconds. No, 20 slides in 20 seconds each. So it's boom, 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 boom. But thank you for rushing through that. I think it's really interesting. Just a few things here is that you are talking about the accessibility and scaling of the learning, right? That's something that usually we talk about, the scaling of the programs and the skills and scopes of the programs, but you're really focused in the HLA on scaling the learning to as many organizations as possible. And the freedom and local coordinators having the freedom and flexibility to shape something that they feel is relevant for their context. I think there's a question maybe also that Deegan can come to in your contribution just now, is to what extent is this capacity strengthening and international actors investing in and committing to capacity strengthening still a way to hang on to the power, in a way to still be able to, determine and influence through funding or through supporting how the system works? So that may be an interesting question maybe to pull into your talk. Can I invite you up for your contribution, Deegan? I don't have a PowerPoint. Do you mind if I just sit here?
Yeah, you're very welcome to.
Good morning. I'm getting old, so I'm in denial about needing bifocals. So I have to take these off to read. So I don't know if I can do 6 minutes. Jill, congrats on doing that. But I just want to talk about capacity completely differently. And I think the reason why the terminology and the 6 different terminology that you mentioned, I think, or 5 or whatever they were, are so controversial is because of the word capacity in itself. There's an assumption that we lack capacity and the North has capacity. I can give you many examples of where we've developed the capacity of individuals from the global North as well as institutions from the global North. And I think we need to move the narrative from capacity strengthening, which is a term I'm sorry to say I can't stand, to more around systems building, investments in organizational systems or organizational development, which is the terminology we like to use at NEAR. We're not developing human capacity. People have capacity inherently. What we are developing and what the conversation is around, which is why it translates naturally into risks, is about, do you as an institution have the due diligence requirements to take money at the scale of an NGO? That's around systems. That's financial systems, that's operational systems, that's HR systems. That has nothing to do with the capacity of the institutions. The institutions certainly have operational capacity, but those systems have been developed by the likes of Northern NGOs in the past 60 years through direct investment of their Northern government. It is these partnership framework agreements that many Danish NGOs still enjoy, that are very flexible, that are primarily unrestricted funding, that has developed the capacity of Danish NGOs, Scandinavian NGOs, in the past British NGOs. I know that history is dying in the UK and some other countries, but I know it's still there in Scandinavian countries. Develop the capacity of Oxfam Novib and all of that. But where is that investment taking place on the side of the Global South? We're not getting the benefit of that capacity investment or that institutional investment through unrestricted funds from our southern governments, our national governments. And we certainly are not getting that kind of investment from INGOs, who are the primary donors of local NGOs. The primary donors to us is INGOs. And majority of the INGOs on a project level give zero overheads to their local partners. When you have zero overheads, basically, what are you doing? You are an invisible donor to a project. Danita gives you huge overheads, but then when you don't pass that overhead to your local NGO partner, you as a local NGO are actually subsidizing that project. We are invisible donors every single day to humanitarian and development action that's happening in our countries. I had one of our members of NEAR from Nepal was telling us how an INGO donors of theirs in Nepal, right after the earthquake, so it was a crazy time, there was a need for massive response, and basically refused to cover any staff costs. They were like, you are all basically volunteers and you should stay that way. So they had a discussion as a team and they agreed to take the funding because these were their people. They felt an obligation. They felt a sense of duty and desire to help their people. And that's the thing that motivates us. It's not a job for us. So we end up agreeing to grant contracts that really are harming us, harming our institutions. So, so I think I'll give you a few examples of where Adesso has developed the capacity. Before I give you the examples, let me give you an example of positive INGO capacity investment or institutional investment. Oxfam Novib was one of our first INGO partners. This was the old days when they had partnership framework agreements. Now they don't enjoy those unrestricted funding. So their agreements with their partners are still now going to the other side of the extreme, which is very project-based and oftentimes no unrestricted funding. But the olden days, Oxfam Novib in Somalia gave us 25% unrestricted funding for 5 years on our project. And that 25% is what allowed me, as the executive director, to hire the first professional finance person, the first HR person. It was that 25% investment that actually developed our institutional systems. And that was for 5 years. I don't know if any of you as INGOs have actually done that kind of level of investment in core funding and unrestricted to your partners. I actually have a problem when I hear of INGOs talking about working with a partner for 20 years, 15 years, as if something a badge of honor. I challenged Oxfam Novib and I said, I want to get to a place where I don't need you as a donor. And what did they do? They introduced us to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that was our first bilateral donor. That's what they did. Oxfam actually introduced us to their own donor, and we're not scared of us becoming competitors to them. So at what point do local actors graduate from your partnerships? That to me is a true test of serious investment in institutional capacity strengthening. No more trainings. Local NGOs are tired of trainings, frankly. They're done with trainings. What they need is they need unrestricted funding to hire finance people at the market rate that you guys hire them at. Why is it assumed that how many staff have I developed at Adesso who now work for UN agencies and INGOs? We are direct contributors to your capacity. Majority of the CDs and international advisors who come from the Global South in the UN and INGOs come from local NGOs. We groomed them, we developed them. We took chances on hiring people. I have hired people who couldn't write a CV because I saw spark in them, I saw potential in them. These are people that would never qualify to be interviewed, to be shortlisted. So we've invested in their capacity, we've groomed them, we developed them. And then what happens? When we can't afford to keep them and retain them, they go to an INGO or they go to a UN agency. We are contributing to your capacity. I have had 2 internationals come to me as interns, one from the UK and one from the US. We invested in their capacity like we do for people from the global south. There are many Somalis as an example, but I'm using this example of these 2 white people because the assumption is that we need capacity investment. We developed their capacity in cash and social protection. They were with us for 3 to 4 years. Afterwards, they left. The gentleman became an international staff of Save the Children and later DFID. The lady became a staff of Mercy Corps and she heads their global cash and vouchers program, their markets expert globally. Where did they get their start? Us, Adesso. So these are constant examples where we invest in the capacity of Save the Children, Mercy Corps, and other international agencies and UN agencies, and that capacity is not recognized. Now, I want to give you an example of how we're trying to flip things in Somalia. In Somalia, we came together as 9 local NGOs, and we formed a consortium called Nexus. It's Somali-driven. 9 local NGOs are leading the consortium, and we've asked Oxfam to come on board. We looked, analyzed, and we said, we need a fund manager. Let's get a fund manager that we believe will be a good ally, a strong ally, an equal partner, and will actually want to let us lead. And we asked Oxfam to be the fund manager, and we asked Save the Children to be the institutional development partner, technical partner. And so this is an opportunity to showcase not only localization in its best, but Somali-driven humanitarian development and peace building design, creation, innovation, and action. And it's an opportunity for us to negotiate and demonstrate that it's possible for an international to provide value where it's relevant, where we see fit. We're the ones who are telling them this is what we need from you, and where they respect us on an equal level, if not saying, you know what, many times the CD of Oxfam says, this is your decision, this is your prerogative, it's not us to make this decision. You guys do what you want. And they are providing us that ability to really lead in a positive way. So my point is to say, if we really, really want to shift power, if we really want to shift and democratize resourcing, we have to really shift our mentality and our behavior and our attitudes. And having a global policy doesn't oftentimes means it translates to the local level, at the national level. Because we do have struggles with some national staff of great NGOs at the policy level, at the global level. They have great rhetoric, great action, great everything. For the national level, you have problems with people who just don't understand those and hold those values. So there's a big problem also with these global large institutions and machinery and bureaucracies in translating your policy level to your action at the country level. And really, and I believe there has to be much more investment of NGOs in really retraining their staff and removing this brand and idea of being competitors and being in the position of power. There has to be really just serious behavior change that has to happen at the local level. Thank you. Let me end there.
Thank you so much, Tegan.
Should I get down or should
You're welcome to stay, Jill, if you also want to join. So what we're going to do is we're going to move to the next speaker and then come back to all the questions. So I hope you're active listening and you're writing down the kind of things that you want to follow up with different speakers on. But thank you, Tegan, for that very also historical overview of how you as an organization have grown, have been supported, but have supported others and NGOs to grow as well. I think that's a very good reflection of the capacity sharing, the capacity exchange. I think that that the sector is only now talking about, but which your kind of organizational history is exemplary of. John, if I could ask you to come up for the next presentation and give us your perspective as ED of a refugee-led organization in Uganda. You also don't have slides, is that correct? Would you like to come up and take your seat and speak from there?
I don't know, maybe it's it's still cold, or I should remove this?
I'm very cold. So.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is John Jab, for whoever has come late. I hope everyone can see me. Yeah. I'm a South Sudanese refugee in Uganda and a co-founder of Youth Social Advocacy Team. It speaks for itself, Youth Social Advocacy Team, because when we arrived in Uganda, there was no localization, there was no anything, there was just emergency. And we were the recipient of that emergency, of course, the response and whatever that comes in. But 2 years later, we realized things didn't go the way we want, and something has to change. But who will change? We tried to talk to the people, and they couldn't. They were like, yeah, it will be a miracle that a refugee will help another refugee. We're like, really? It can happen. So the doubt was, you know, the South Sudan conflict is so strange, so tribal, so political, and it's a dirty game. And everyone that carry that it look like you're either one of the two sides. So we have two things: to prove that we are neutral, and to prove that we can deliver something. So when we came up with Youth Social Advocacy Team, for those who work with Save the Children, during our high school, during our primary school, there was social advocacy team, a school club or something in South Sudan. And we were two people who co-founded it. We were, I think, 12 years old. And it was about bringing girls, young girls who get married at the age of 15 in South Sudan. Up to now, I think there's no law. So I remembered something like that, and like, okay, maybe we could bring this idea again. And when we started it, we could not register because we're refugees, first of all. And what will we do? So we choose that we will be working on peace building, because the hatred that people have in South Sudan was crossing the border with us. It was following us up to the refugee settlements. And we could see Zone X belonged to a certain number of people, Zone B belonged to that community. And so people couldn't cross. If you cross, it's at your own risk. And when we asked people, why did you do that, especially the government of Uganda? And their response was, yeah, they wanted to separate these people so that they don't fight. They were like, will you follow them back to South Sudan and you will separate them like that? They had no answer. So we started a program called Defy Hate Now. Defy Hate Now. So it's just a campaign when we started, but it looked at how do we talk about misinformation, how do we talk about peaceful coexistence in a way that we are not saying build peace, because we cannot measure peace, we cannot touch it. But if we talk about defying this hatred, you know, being one people, how would that concept be? So the NGOs looked at us, everyone, Oxfam, who serve the children. We were a bunch of crazy refugees who didn't know what they were doing at that time. And until one major conflict happened in 2017, when people who were in a car were stopped, and then they were got out of the car and they were beaten. And we were the first people to respond there, and we got a case. We're like, this is hatred, because if you look at the cause, it is nothing. It's just the race is a race. It's like it is the tribe that these people belong to. And when they really realized it's true, the government had to accept that we register our organization in 2017, and we became a community-based organization. We continued working and doing our advocacy that is voluntarily. But one thing that I could vividly remember was when people want to do an event, they would hire us to do the event, or they will give us whatever they want to give to do the event, and then they take the credit, and then we remain in the community. But the event would be successful. Then we started filing up and asking people, when you engage us, your event is successful. But we don't see ourselves being reflected in what you're doing. Why? So We were useful at the community level, but at your level, no. So we started this advocacy of how do we bridge this gap between the NGOs and the local actors themselves. It was a new thing. There was never been a refugee organization. So that was the first breakthrough with us, was when we had a podcast interview with a German organization, Rogue Agency for Open Culture and Critical Transformation. They were looking for South Sudanese who are doing peace building in the refugee settlements. And we were the group. They say, yeah, there's that group, it's there, so you can try, talk to them and see what they're doing. So we were successful, and then we started doing work with them. We had activities, and now the NGOs, I don't know which tool they use to assess capacity, or which tool do you guys use to assess capacity? They started coming, they started wondering, so how did this group within us get attention of someone outside? So they start now like coming in slowly by slowly. So what, maybe tell us what you're trying to do. How does it connect to this event of the capacity? Because there are people within you now who are doing great work, but because you put on a lens of they don't have capacity, you don't even see the value that they are doing with you. Yeah, until another person will come and see the value in them, then you'll be surprised. Not even Oxfam that time, it was Norwegian People's Aid, who again saw what we're doing on media, and then they came, they interact with us. They gave us a very simple tool. And I challenge, I think, most of us in this room, how many pages of your assessment do you have? It's a long, probably 10 pages, right? So they only came with 1 page only. And that was the tool they used to assess over 15 organizations in Uganda, but South Sudanese. And we were successful. And when we put on that logo of NPA, you know, it's one of the biggest organizations in South Sudan long term, and everyone ran, even including Oxfam. Like, these guys, they're now working with NPA? No way. Even UN agencies, UNHCR, they had to come, and I'm like, okay, tell us, do you think, it seems you have capacity now? Then we were asking them, what capacity? They're like, yeah, how did you get to work with NPA? How did you get to work with these organizations? And then one thing I remember I told them was, maybe tell me how you measure capacity, and then maybe we can answer. And they didn't have an answer of how they measure capacity. So I think when we put the lens of seeing the local NGOs as people without capacity, even when they have capacity, you will not accept that they have. Yes, believe me or not. But when we are open to see what capacity you have, what capacity gap do you need, and then it becomes capacity building. Yeah. So in this case, Oxfam was the first organization in Uganda, I would say, that managed to engage now, I think, over 15 refugee-led organizations. As I speak, there are more than 20. But Oxfam is learning from that very lesson that actually there are capacities that just need to be built. They were able to engage in more of capacity. And for me, if you talk about capacity and what we want, we don't just need, money. We don't just need funding, but we want you to prepare us for tomorrow. If you are engaging the local actors now in assessing their capacities, in building, their institutional capacities, in giving them some human resource, like you would wonder, how did we manage to reach up to this far? Like now we have, I think, 5 to 6 donor organizations that are working with us. And what we did was that we would send one of our staff to the organization. That was the only condition we would tell them. Because they will ask, what capacity do you want? We tell them, we can't measure our capacity. So we will give you one of our staff, just 3 to 4 months, we'll stay in your office, and then you bring back. And Norwegian Refugee Council did that. And then we had separate children, they did that for one of our staff. And then CEFOT, which is funded by Oxfam, did it actually for myself. And the 3 of us, when we came back, we were very okay. And that's where we started. And so in this room, I would say that's one learning lesson that we could all take. If you don't want to send your staff because it cannot be managed by the local NGOs, please get us. Give us the space in your office. That will really help, and it will close this gap of capacity. And then in Uganda, we have so many things that really worked very well, the consortium that worked. And also the co-applicants. I think it's one of the good practice that is coming up in Uganda, where the INGOs, encourage a local partner and an international partner to apply together for funding, which to me is a great thing. Like this year, we had to apply to WFP through another partner, and when one of our colleagues heard of it, he was like, "Do you have capacity to apply for that?" And we said, "No, we apply as a co-applicant." Say, "Oh, okay." At least I thought. So you see, the idea is still very hard. And we will not reach there as long as we still create the boundary of INGOs and local NGOs. We will not reach to the localization we are talking about. But if we do it like as a team, recognizing that local partners have certain skills, and then also the INGOs has certain skills, if they can be merged together, we can reach to where we are. And then I think that will be the only road that will let us reach the localization and the capacity. Because believe me or not, the INGOs are also learning from the local NGOs. So if we recognize that, then it becomes a two-way advantage. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for all those personal anecdotes. What I'm personally also very curious about, I know that you have also been working with the MIT Development Lab on some creative capacity building work. And I was just thinking within the humanitarian sector, there's limits to innovation and how to be able to innovate within the system or within the project cycles and the funding cycles. Was what you did with the MIT, was that in any way hugely different? Was it really pushing the boundaries? Do you think there's anything in there that the humanitarian sector might see whether to adopt or not?
It's interesting, actually. I don't always like boring people much with talking because I will be available. You can ask me anything. But we're doing what we call creative capacity building with MIT G-Lab. And it's a program that put the local communities first. It's using the co-creation, where communities decide what is their major need, how should they do it, when should they do it, and why they should actually do it. And so what MIT does is they work with us as the local partner. They look for money wherever they get it, then they give it to us. We don't even touch the money. We go to the local community and ask them what exactly do they want. And as I speak now, we have 6 projects that are running, and they are done by the community themselves. So it has the CCB approach is, it has a problem identification. Most of us, if I tell you how you solve it, problem, solution. But the design cycle doesn't work that way. It has, the problem, you have to identify the problem, you learn about it, you have to prototype or have ideas, choose the best idea, build it, test it. If the feedback always is either negative or positive, then you repeat. So I think it's a very good opportunity for us when we are talking about this capacity building and how it can be done. And it's a tool that is available, it can be shared with anyone who wants it. But I think it's an example of how do we put people first and how do we work with the people, not for the people. Because in this room, many of us plan in the Netherlands, in Denmark, for things to be done elsewhere. But then with the CCB, the people are the one planning for what they will be doing themselves. And I think this is what makes the difference.
Thank you very much. So you as a local NGO take on a facilitation role, an enabling role for the communities, right? I think that's also interesting to explore possibly in this capacity development discussion, is that a lot of the localization discourse focuses on, at least the ones that I participate in, focus on institutional, registered organizations, formal organizations, etc. But this link to community-led and building on community agency, facilitating community agency to respond themselves, I think is a really interesting link that for me at least needs further exploration. So then to finish this first part of the contributions and then actually going into the participatory part, I would like to invite Petra, also with experience related to Uganda. So then also be interesting to reflect a little bit on how refugee-led organizations might or might not figure in the kind of work that the Elna does.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, it's a PowerPoint. Sorry, I think after this, I'm not going to be as excited, but I'll try to keep it short. So I manage a program called Empowering Local and National Humanitarian Actors, Elna for short, and it's being implemented in Uganda and Bangladesh. And it's about trying to implement local humanitarian leadership. So really operationalizing how can we do that in practice. And one aspect is to look at capacity from a system strengthening approach. What does that mean? We'll go into that. It was mentioned actually briefly by Deegan before. So why do we take this approach to capacity development? It comes from Oxfam, the idea that we want to foster local humanitarian leadership. And we realize that it's an agenda that requires a level of change in the whole humanitarian system that we cannot define ourselves. It needs to be defined by the actors of that system, the local actors. What Oxfam can do is to facilitate that process. So taking the position of Oxfam not as the implementers, not as the ones that go out, but the ones that allow for that system to change. So how do you invest in a system change? So by system change, we mean the humanitarian system. How do we make it locally led? How do we make it empowering of local actors? So there's three main things, I would say, just to keep it simple. One is to change the way you assess and address capacity. And I agree with Deegan, maybe even the word capacity puts everybody already off in terms of 30, 40 years, I don't know how many years we've done capacity. So everybody is thinking of capacity really as one type of thing. It's training, or it's workshops, or it's building somebody else's strength. So in that case, we move away from a project-based capacity building, and we look at, because it's very much short-term, it's very much just for implementing a project and doesn't allow the organizations to be sustainable through in the long term. We promote leadership and ownership by local and national humanitarian actors. So they are the ones that determine what capacity to strengthen, how to do that, and especially very important, by whom. So it's not that it's Oxfam going in, assessing what is needed, and then providing the capacity, but it is the local actors that define what is needed and how to address it. And consider capacity as a competency. And this means that it can be technical, it can be operational, but it can be many other things. And it's that capacity that also John was talking about. First, it seemed that they had no capacity, and all of a sudden they had it, right? So it's because there are so many other aspects of what makes you a strong actor in relation to a community, which has to do with your understanding of the context, with the networks you have, with the trust you have built. And that is never measured in an assessment by international organizations. And then looking at contributing to the growth of the capacity, not of an individual, not of an organization, but of, in this case, a district. So how, let's say, the district humanitarian system can be made stronger. So looking at it from a perspective of the system. So these are the types of what each partner can contribute. And it's what type of capacity you have, whether it's physical resources, networks, information, the people you know. These are all capacities you have. The second point is to work with a broad spectrum of local actors. So we often go in and just go for the humanitarian actors, the implementers, the ones that will implement a program for us. But there's a whole array of actors around that that play a role and contribute to that local system. This is also a realization, I think it's an important point, the second one. Very few local actors are humanitarian actors. They are development actors, and they just find themselves that there's an emergency, there's a crisis, and they have to support. But their work is primarily development. So this is a way we look at it. So you have in the center, let's say, the humanitarian implementers. There are some organizations that are specialized in that. But then you have the circles around it, and these are three, maybe there's five, I don't know. But to say that there's also actors, for example, women rights organizations. Do they need to be also humanitarian responders per se? Maybe not, but they have a thematic specialization that they can bring and contribute to. Third one is integrate your support in local systems and structures. So whatever you do, don't create new layers, don't create parallel systems. Look at what is already there. What are the local government structures? What are the local contingency plans in place? And how, as an organization, can you support those and promote and strengthening those? I'll go a little faster. So for the Elna process, okay, maybe this might be a little, okay, the whole, so it starts, how do you do all of this, right? So it starts off where we have tested is a humanitarian context, capacity context analysis. And that looks at the sector of humanitarian, both what are the enablers, what are the blockers, what are the strengths. So you look at all the system as a whole, and what are also the dynamics between the different actors. So you look also at aspects of power relations and influences. Based on that, we did it at the district level in Uganda and Bangladesh. You bring together a whole range of local actors, humanitarian, development, private sector, the media, CBOs, anybody that plays a role within that space. And they define, they look at these recommendations, these outcomes, and they define a joint action plan. And it's a long-term plan, it's a 5-year plan in terms of how do we make our humanitarian system locally stronger. And so they set out a couple of objectives on how to meet those. And then they define how to get there. And they define what gaps they have to get there, what are the barriers, what are the strengths. And so together, they develop their own capacity plan, let's say. Then they themselves also define where to source that capacity. It could be often what has happened is that they identify among each other. So those that are strong on gender issues, they can provide capacity on that. And so they find that sometimes Oxfam is in. And that's how they implement this. And finally, we have a grant facility. When there is an emergency, it's only accessible by local actors. They can apply to respond. So this is it's an interesting extra modality that allows the capacity you have built to put it into practice and demonstrate that you can implement projects. So what has come out of this? I have 3 minutes. By coming all together, one, people start understanding who the actors are, working more together. It strengthens collaboration, it strengthens trust, which then builds networks for more collective action, more influencing. Consortia are built, so you have also more competitiveness with certain funding arrangement, more representation in decision-making spaces, and ultimately we have seen increased access to funding from other agencies. Let me just get that. So for example, yeah, this is the Bangladesh platform, women's platform. They're pictured here. So these are some of the networks that have come out from this process. And we have many, both at the national level in Uganda, but also at the district level in both Bangladesh and Uganda. Increased funding to local actors. So very small organizations, for example, in Uganda, through this process have then received more funding from others. But there's also been processes of influencing policies and practices of the government. So because they have this collective approach and this long-term vision on what needs to change, often it's the capacity of the system that needs to change is, for example, making the humanitarian governance stronger. So they identify where the government is weak, what budget requirements are needed, for example, and they're able to push that. Increased access to coordination spaces. So they both are now decision makers in the humanitarian country task teams, for example, and other spaces where donors are. And that's it.
Within time. Thank you, Petra, and feel free to take your seat if you want. Just one question that kind of wants to be asked, I think, is when you think of John's story and the way his organization was registered, first informally and then registered and not seen in terms of the visibility of the work they were doing, and then becoming more and more visible and others coming on. Where within the Elna approach, if this is indeed an interesting approach with these results, where in the Elna have you been able to support organizations like John's, or has the work within the districts that the Elna supports become more people-centered? Do you think, no is also okay, but do you think that it has contributed to more inclusion?
Yeah, so I think that was a process in itself. So it started off as a project that was very organizational focused. So it's about strengthening local organizations, and by those meaning registered formal organizations. And I think along the way, we realized that the representation wasn't necessarily as inclusive as it should have been. So for example, women rights organizations or community-based organizations were not as engaged in this process. And so we did have to bring in an extra element of purposefully bringing them into that process. So in the phase we're in now, they're much more engaged. But I think it brings back also, who are the actors that show up? And sometimes you need to also realize what the dynamics are within. You have power dynamics at all levels. And I think one important lesson is you don't have homogeneity. Hello? Finished. Maybe that's a way to. Hello?
No.
Anyway, maybe I can speak like this? Yes. I think important to realize that the affected community is not a homogeneous group to start off with, right? Even within them, they have marginalized groups or groups that are not well represented. The same, you have it in the government. You have parts of the government that are more allies with what you do than others. So it's very important when you define who is participating and who is part of it, that you have that awareness of the dynamics that are there, will always be there, but also how to make sure that you are playing a role in being as inclusive as possible in that process. So it does require that kind of proactive effort on that side.
Thank you to all of you. I think it's brought really interesting perspectives forward for discussion amongst yourselves, but also with the audience. So what I'd like to do now is actually, for each of you, there's been sticky notes passed around. So what I'd like to do now, just in a very kind of blitz, quick fashion, is to take a minute for yourself to think through what is the one question that I would like to ask to one of the speakers, or maybe to the entire workshop. What is the one question that is on my mind that I would like to put forward, and write that down on your sticky note. I'm going to rush you through this a little bit. After your 1 minute, I'm going to ask you to exchange with your neighbor and just exchange what your questions are. And then after that, exchange with 2 people around you, and then sift through and find out the 2 questions that you would like to bring forward into the discussion. So it's really a little bit first for yourself and then moving on, and I'll guide you through that. For the people online, I'm sorry that we're not able to bring you in this part of the participatory session, if you will, defining the questions. I think the technology will allow us for you to put questions into this chat box, which we can then also pick up and put forward to the presenters as part of the conversation. And so we'll take a maximum of around 8 minutes for this entire little interval. So also feel free to converse amongst yourselves on what are the issues that you would like to also bring forward still in terms of this topic, this discussion. And thank you also to our participants online for putting all your very interesting questions forward. Perhaps to start with online, I think that's probably good practice in this day and age. Let me see. So I'm not going through any sort of chronological order. I'm going to try and pick and choose and see how many we can take. And there's one actually that I was thinking, Dana, I might put to you. Because you mentioned the importance of the long-term relationships, the 5 years, the 25% unrestricted over the programs that you were implementing with your donor, that really enabled your organization to grow and to build the institutional capacity that you needed. There was a question online, and we're having a bit of a fickle connection, but there was a question online on how the strengthening, capacity strengthening related to project implementation, so the specific projects rather than the long-term relationship. How do you see that? And do you see that as any different from localization? So there's two questions in one, really. You know, what you said was critical, the long-term, the strategic investment versus the project context that many of the colleagues are working in, both at local and international level. And do you see a difference between capacity strengthening as part of project implementation and localization? So it's a bit of a lengthy one, but hopefully you can shed some insight.
Okay, yeah, I think you can do it at two levels. So you have a project. Can we maybe envision a different kind of construct of how to implement that project? Instead of putting in your budget X number of staff for your internationals, X number of staff for your nationals, X number of operational costs for your office and all of that. Can we just remove all of that and think about designing the budget with your partner, number one, designing the proposal with your partner, and letting them put in their actual costs and let them implement the project. And you put in as minimal staff as possible and maybe embed your staff in that partner's office instead of creating a separate structure. Projects are designed by nature, the budgets are designed by nature to what? Beef up your staff capacity in that country and your costs. We all know that, that's the reality. So flip that and say, I'm willing to take less of a cut and give more to the partner, let them implement, let them lead it, let them be transparent in designing your budget with them. Yeah, make sure you have an honest conversation about the unrestricted and how you share it, proportionally maybe based on the implementation size, and let them lead and you embed your staff in their office. That obviously means that you have to be ready to become smaller. Yeah. And that goes against the ethos mandate of every CEO of every INGO is to become smaller. Number two is challenge your donors, your back-end donors to say, I want to, you know that there will be a crisis in Nepal, inshallah not, but the geologists and everybody's telling us that there will be another earthquake eventually. Why don't we think now about pre-positioning capacity and investing in those partners that are women's groups, human rights groups that end up being first responders by design, no, by accident, yeah? And start working with them now so that when something happens, work with the district authorities who are the duty bearers, work with the national government, pre-position capacity now instead of waiting for the crisis to happen. So how do you, now it's, I think the responsibility and the onus is on you as internationals to work with your back-end national donors to help you, give you those kinds of flexible instruments to do that. That would be, I think, the two ideas I would have.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to respond to that particular one, or there's other questions? Do you have particular reflections on this?
Perhaps just a general idea, which we didn't mention specifically, is capacity for what? Maybe that allows us then to differentiate between different types. So if it's capacity because you want to implement a project, then there's certain elements that you can go through that are already more empowering and more about an equal partnership relation. But then there's capacity ultimately for you as an organization to move out and to strengthen that organization locally so that they can be sustainable in the long term. And that's a whole different approach on how you engage in that partnership. It's a long-term engagement. It looks at institutional strengthening of that organization, but it also requires commitment and responsibility from the local actor in terms of where they see themselves in terms of an organization within that context. So then you have, it's important to look at all of these as different types of partnerships that you have, and within that, capacity plays one role in it. So I would differentiate between those.
Thank you. I've just sifted through a lot of the questions, and there's a lot for Digan, actually. Digan and John.
Yeah, this is,
Which one do I pick? I think there's an interesting one maybe for John. I'm just going to put it to you because your organization somewhat represents the youth, and there's a question that speaks about what can we do to include children and their capacity that they inherently have when working to localize humanitarian work or to build on local actors and local agents' work in the humanitarian programming or in the humanitarian sector. What do you think could be done? Is there a room to involve children or not? What could be done?
Thank you so much. On the involvement of young people, we actually work directly with youth, and that includes at some point children. And what we do is that, well, with most of our donors, they don't decide for us what we maybe apart from Oxfam here. So the rest of our partners, they don't decide what we do. We literally bring the ideas from the community, and that's what has helped us grow to where we are now. Because we feel there's a lot of humanitarian support, but it ended up in the market, it ended up in shops, it ended up in in stores, because people don't actually want what you give at some point, But when you consult them for the children, if we can involve the kids, if we can involve the youth in asking them, one practical question in Uganda was 2015, 2016. All the youth, I would say 80%, never participated in meetings. When UN comes, they say, go to women. Why? Because the intervention comes and it focuses on women, it focuses on vulnerable people, and then they were like a single group that are not vulnerable. So they were left just playing football. When a partner is coming to do something, they just ask, okay, we are giving you football, you play the game. Really, is that what people want? Should they play the whole time? No. So that, because they were not involved in any way. But if you go now, some of them are running these enterprises, some of them are running the innovation spaces. Why? Because they are now being involved. They start asking them, why don't you come for a meeting? Then they say, no, those meetings are for leaders. They're for you and the women and everything. So I think what we can do with children, with youth, is we first need to consult them. Before you start doing anything, please ask what they want. And when you bring what they want, you will see how sustainable that becomes. I don't know what, but they will tell you what they want.
Thank you, John. There's a number around learning, and so I want to pull in a few of you. Everybody looks to Jill around learning, but it's really also triggered by what you also said, Digan, about reversing learning, right? So of you building the capacity of Oxfam Novib, actually, all those years ago, and probably still now, Oxfam in Somalia with the Nexus platform and all those relationships. So I'm just going to read them out, and then maybe we can reflect on them together. So, Digan, you mentioned that there needs to be more recognition of the South-North capacity. So what does this recognition what does this look like? What would you like to see, ideally, in that recognition of South-North capacity, and the North learning from the South, if you want to use those terms? But also, and related to that, how do we support this change in the direction of learning? How can maybe it be more intentionally thought through and acknowledged that we need to do reversed or facilitate or allow or whatever it might be for reversed capacity building? So those are two that are kind of also interesting then from the Humanitarian Learning Academy on how do you work with that, if you recognize that or not. And then another question related to the learning is more, how do we as Northern organizations, so the representatives of Northern organizations in the room, how do we relate to learning requests from organizations in the Global South? So if you imagine if you have many partners in a particular program or in a particular country and lots of diverse learning requests coming in, what do you see as useful ways in which NGOs, other organizations can work with those diverse learning requests? So did I capture those questions okay? Is there a clarification that you'd like to make? Is that okay? So I guess, again, a little bit to Jill and maybe Digan and also John or Petra on how you work with the learning agenda in Elna could be interesting.
Great, thank you. And so just quickly to say that we're not an implementation organisation in the sense of we don't deliver trainings. So one of our big things is scalability. So a lot of what we do is delivered remotely, and the collaboration is kind of the keystone of everything the Humanitarian Leadership Academy does. So we've got a network of affiliated partners globally, as well as a number of global partners. And so one of the things that we really rely on this network of partners to do is to really generate context-specific understanding of what's needed for them. So quite often at the kind of global level, we will do scoping to see what needs assessments are what needs are coming up from the kind of global sphere. So obviously in the sector, safeguarding is a huge big thing for the sector. And everyone was about to build learning on safeguarding. So there was about 10 organisations we spoke to. They were all about to put £50,000 into building learning on safeguarding. And we said, stop, maybe we can work on this together. Maybe we can draw in more people. We can make something more collaborative and something from the sector. What we then look to our local partners to then do is say, okay, so this baseline training has been created. How can we contextualize this and make this more relevant to our specific localities? But this also works two ways. So they also do their own needs assessments and their scoping. They work with their local partners in turn, and they say, well, actually, in our area, so particularly for in the Philippines, they've produced a whole series of learning on BLAST, DRM, so disaster risk reduction modules. They do lots of business continuity planning, and they push that out through the same platform. And again, they encourage in turn our other global partners to take these ideas and contextualize them. In Bangladesh, we've recently seen loads of stuff doing on flood prevention and cyclone preparedness, and now our Kenyan organisation members are thinking, oh well, how can we potentially look at that in line of what's happened recently in Mozambique? So we don't have any direct partners in Mozambique, but they're about to start scoping to see if that's something of interest. So for us, it's kind of a cycle of learning and how learning needs are generated for us, and we continually get feedback on what's relevant. But as well, we try and make a lot of our materials available for local organisations to do that contextualisation piece. Take it.
Yeah, I think the first point I would say is humility. I think it's that, the inherent, the understanding of the inherent capacity of everybody. I have a lot to learn, I'm sure, from colleagues in Denmark, and I think that I think they have a lot to learn from me. So I think that understanding of our equal desire as human beings to teach each other. So that's one thing I would start off with, and that requires obviously behavior change. Second thing I would say is that we're not looking, someone asked me the same question earlier, we're not looking for a prize of some sort to be created to say recognizing Global South NGOs and developing the capacity of the Northerners. What we're just saying is that let's change the narrative around this capacity conversation, so it's not seen as a one-sided thing. And let's also influence donors to not view capacity in one skewed way, which is all around due diligence. And that has been the whole entire conversation around the whole localization is, okay, we don't think you have capacity to meet our due diligence requirements, you're too risky. So how do we help organizations graduate so that they can meet our our due diligence requirements? So it's all about that. It has nothing to do with operational capacity, my understanding of the context, and all of these other things. So my ability to innovate and all of these things. So I think it's also changing that the perceptions around risk. Is there a risk associated with an international flying in from London who has no clue about what it means to operate in Somalia? Isn't that a risk? But that's not part of the risk assessment, you see. So one of the things we were thinking as an idea that I had years ago was, and actually it's being worked on by a few different actors now, all Northern actors, but I'm glad it's being worked on. This is another thing, we come up with solutions and ideas, and who do the donors fund? They fund Northern actors to do our things for us, When are we going to get out of the localization conversation being around solutions that are funded by Northern donors to Northern agencies? So is about having a TripAdvisor or Yelp from the community. If the community rates Adeso's programs as being more successful, they might not, but if they say that, you know, we trust Adeso more, would that be rated equally as high as the financial due diligence that Adeso receives or the financial capacity of Save the Children? Is that going to be equally weighted, you know, in a due diligence process? How do we have standardization that equally will respect the feedback from the communities as they will respect the financial due diligence that an organization is able to meet? So I'm glad to see that ODI and others are working on this idea of a Yelp, a TripAdvisor from the community, having proper community feedback mechanisms. I mean, we keep talking about participatory revolution. Well, the revolution is for the communities to decide as the real clients, you know? They are not beneficiaries, they are clients. I always say that the aid sector has become more corporatized. Becoming multi-billion-dollar agencies might be, I think, is a questionable kind of strategy, but that has been the strategy and the trajectory of most INGOs for the past 10, 15 years. Fine, but who's the real client? The client, if it was more proper corporates, majority of INGOs would be fired. You see, in the communities. But the client is the DFIDs. The client is the back donor. The client is not the community. So how do we really, if we're talking about serious participation revolution, if we really want to have revolution, then put them at the driver's seat of saying which organization they believe has the quality to deliver in their community and actually rate them and be public about it and be ready to receive that feedback.
Okay, I just want to add, I know our time is bad, but on this, I would add that if we are also designing with and by, but not for, I think we will be able to allow learning. Because for us, when we go to the communities and we're like, I have a paper that is from Oxfam, and you know, you have to follow what is in there, and then you actually miss some valuable information that you should have learned. Because people won't tell you, it's not captured in your questionnaire, I would say, yeah? And then the information that you go to collect, maybe they don't give you. And this has been affecting a lot the capacities, because you don't talk about the capacity that that person has, you only know the capacity that you have. I would say if we want to allow learning, if we can all sit at a table and discuss as people who just want to intervene, but not people who have money and those who need the money, because this is what creates the gap. Even if I have something to tell you that you know can change your intervention, but you have the power to say you don't give me the money or you will. So you find very few who are focused on having the service delivered go through, and many are blocked because if you happen to say that, then maybe service children will not give you the funds. You know, so the power dynamic of money, decision, and policies is the one that is cutting our learning. If we can go with open mind to the communities and recognize that they are people who are not just beneficiaries, but they can actually shape our organizational policies themselves, then we can be ready to learn. You talk about the rating. I don't know if there's anyone from DRC here, Danish Refugee Council, sorry to say that. But you're from there, thank you. So we did a rating like what she said now to DRC, and we wanted to actually change the whole DRC in the settlement, because they will say, we are working in all the 32. And we are asking, how much capacity do you have? We were asking an international organization, how much capacity do you have to work in 32 villages? And they were like, how can you ask? You're just a community-based organization. What capacity do you have? And we're like, okay, let's see. We did the same due diligence with our own. And you know what happened? We recommended they leave the settlement because they were more focused on getting more money, but do less work in the community than actually getting more money and involving more people or even listening to our recommendation. And now I have to tell you, DRC is good. After that recommendation, they are now very good. They were able to open doors for other partners to handle other sectors. But for 2-3 years, they were saying, no. Actually, they would block some organizations from participating in some. We're saying this because this is where our policy comes from. You know? And these are things that we don't want. And they don't, just imagine if we have come to your office and say, this is not running right. And you say, okay, fine, you incorporate it and change. Will it reach to a point of, you know, writing, how do we call it? a vote of no confidence? No. But because you think you know, and you're from Denmark, and I am from Uganda, you know the difference, the power? So I think if we put people first, learning will be smooth. But if we put money and our status, we will not learn. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And just before we break for our break, actually, I would also like to put the same question to Abdirahman, because we're going to come back after break for a presentation from TAS, the Executive Director of TAS in Somalia, and the Somalian Humanitarian Fund. But with this question that the panel has been reflecting on in terms of how do you reverse learning? How do you, because I've seen you work with many UN agencies, you work with many of the international NGOs that are here in the room. What do you feel has worked best in terms of reversing learning, in terms of them listening to you and bringing your expertise in and shifting the ways that the international system works based on your experience? And please do come up and allow people to see you better. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think the localization is a kind of the process of inheritance. Because of when we are talking about localization, I think we have to mean that guys, or whether from UN or international, maybe Wednesday we are not be with you in Somalia or in Uganda, might be, or in other areas where. So we are going. So you have to have your own capacity. You have to have your own capability to keep after or look after and protecting your children, delivering service to your people. So really, we will appreciate how the UN and the other international NGOs now serving and delivering the assistance to the local people in Somalia. But I think all the issues that Degan has mentioned really is worthwhile, and I'm also emphasizing it. But I really trying to add that the process of localization is starting to give more the empowerment process to the local organization. Let me take a sample. And we have been working with the UN and the other international NGOs since 2005. I can say the last 15 years, more than maybe 50 staff who will get the capacity from TAS or from our partners. Now they shifted to the international NGOs, or they now with UN NGOs. I'm not trying to say that you are stealing us, but I'm trying. It's better really to empower us and empower our staff, even sometimes doing as seconding the staff with us, within us. So I think localization now, depending on, you have to believe as international NGOs or UN NGOs that it's very important for the local NGOs to have their own capacity, whether as in the level of their staff, whether as their level of the fund process, all that. So maybe I will talk about broadly in my presentation. So I will only comment that.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for this part of the session. I hope it's been really useful so far. I think the comments online were really appreciative of everything that you guys have brought in. So let's have a quick break. And
maybe I'm a little bit confusing with the climate in Denmark. So is it now morning or evening or afternoon? So good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, so I think what is it? I should see like this. Oh, okay. So I think no need to introduction. So almost Saskina, am I right? Saskia already introduced it about what my NGO does. So my name is Abdirahman. I'm the executive director of TAS, the national NGO based as Saskia mentioned. So directly I will talk about the localization in practice, assessing and strengthening capacities of local actors. So first of all, let us highlight about the general situation in Somalia. There are factors that contribute the vulnerability and the increased demands of the humanitarian intervention constantly these factors can be as flowing conflict. Maybe when you hit Somalia, suddenly you remember conflict. So the reason of conflict among terrorist attacks, clan conflicts over scarce resources such as water, pastoral land for animal grazing and so on. Also recurrent natural disasters like droughts that sweep the livestock and agriculture production. Frequently, I think you experience a lot of droughts. The last one, it was in 2007. So almost that drought sweep the livestock and the other resources in Somalia. And so this results insecurity, displacement, loss of lives and property, violation of human rights, malnutrition, death, loss of livestock, so on. Due to the limited capacity of the federal government and the member states, there are no relevant support to lessen the vulnerability. And aid from international donors play a gigantic role in surviving lives of the affected communities in Somalia. And the capacity of local actors in gradually improving through capability buildings by international UN agencies and local scholars, preventing crisis through conciliation and peace building among conflicted populations to avoid further humanitarian crisis and advocacy for affected communities. Local actors have played an especially major role in reaching the most vulnerable populations with significant support from the ISHF as well as the non-traditional donors such as the diaspora, the private sector, and the other international agencies. So mainly when talking about the humanitarian aid in Somalia, it may happen that we neglect or we ignore the role of Somali diaspora because of we experience a lot of schoolies, a lot of emergence or drought response that undertaken by the Somali diaspora. So I think I don't know whether they were invited in this meeting or not. If they were not invited, I hope the next meeting they should be invited because of they are contributing a lot in the Somali humanitarian interventions. According to country-based bullet funds, recently increases to direct funds to local actors, NGOs to reach vulnerable people in distinctive geographical locations within the country. The localization of humanitarian interventions may result in empowerment of local actors, earlier humanitarian interventions, accessibility, suitability, and advocacy. And maybe it's not so the way I've written it, but really whenever we give the access the local NGOs, it is much better that the interventionists can be area responded. According to recommendations by Somali NGO Consortium and other international humanitarian actors and government of Somalia, it was acknowledged that a Somali-led approach and is committed to work with local NGOs to realize local initiatives and approach to access solutions through collaboration. Engaging the process of capacity assessment model to strengthen their capacities and access funds. Additionally, developing partnership between local and international actors in areas of capacity building, improving accountability systems, and long-term collaborations enhances the ability for local actors to respond. And why localization is important for humanitarian interventions, especially in Somalia. As per recommendations from both local and international actors, improving accessibility of vulnerable communities is one. And the second could be a reduction of management costs, as local actors have already been present in the country where the operation is taking place. I think mainly when we are a local actors, because of the international and the other UN NGOs that they pay a lot of overheads and admin costs when they try to make interventions in Somalia. So since the local actors now they are operating in the area, I think the management costs can be less than what the other international or UN agencies are using. So the third one will be a country approach of humanitarian interventions can lead to addressing relevant needs when a standardized assessment is carried out. It improves the sustainability when the approach is inclusive and well planned. Prevents misconception by communities on not being engaged and have less influence in humanitarian aid decisions. So that we really experience it when the local NGOs lead any intervention. It may be more easier when the other international NGOs are leading. So it also recommend that the local actors to lead as a priority in intervention. The limited capacity and the improvement areas, still there is local actors has still experienced challenges in accessing funds, staff retention, the one I just mentioned during my comment, and capacity building. So our recommendation is to support local actors, Somali federal government and its member state, and as well as other national NGOs and the CPOs to develop respective policies and allow that govern and contribute the effectiveness of humanitarian interventions. Also, we recommend building the capacity local actors, understanding of working in international humanitarian systems, identification and prioritization of humanitarian interventions, like knowing what, where, and how. Enable them access funds and long-term projects to that can impact the humanitarian situation and the staff retention to avoid staff turnover. Building the capacity of local actors in areas of compliance might be digging will worry that recommendation, but I hope since a lot of staff turnover from the local NGOs and running after the international NGOs, I think still there are some local NGOs needs the empowerment of the capacity building. Enable them to participate in international humanitarian conferences, to access information exchange, knowing international aid standards, fund opportunities, and collaborations and planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just interested because we're going to be speaking to the representative of the Somalia Humanitarian Fund in a moment. You had a slide here around capacity, and especially from the country-based pooled funds perspective. And so you named here that how engaging in a process of capacity assessment, etc., would strengthen the capacities and enable you to access funds additionally. So I was just wondering, how have you been engaging with the Somalia country-based pooled fund, and have you been able to either source funding from them, and how has that worked in terms of, you know, the due diligence requirements and all the perhaps stringent requirements of such a fund, and or could be both. Has your work with the country-based pooled fund in Somalia also enabled you to invest further in your organization systems, procedures, protocols, you know, as discussed earlier? So how has working with the Somalia Humanitarian Fund enabled your capacity to date?
I think when I'm talking here on behalf of local actors in Somalia, I think not only be us or ADESA, because there is a lot of other local NGOs who may not have the access to get such opportunity in order to be a partner with SHF or other international NGOs. I think still there is a gap. We cannot say that on behalf of local NGOs, all local actors have the access to get empowerment or capacity building from the INGOs, or they have the access of getting fund. And in Puntland, if I take as example, now I think I'm the second. We are 3 or 4 only who has the eligibility access the fund from the SHF. So all that requirements which is required by the NGOs to fulfill, sometimes it can be very difficult to access the funds. So we recommend that the due diligence and the other requirements, we are not really encouraging to avoid or to leave the other requirements, but it should be sometimes applicable to the local NGOs. Yes, there is a lot of well wishes and a lot of local actors who may really be active, or sometimes it's better than the NGOs in terms of knowing better than in the context. So, but since they don't have all that capacity, all that list of due diligence requirements, they may stay in their villages or in their with their local actors. So we recommend that, and all the other actors, whether they are CPOs or the other national NGOs, should be equally access to the fund, and side by side by empowering them and giving them the ability or the chance to capacity.
Thank you. I think at this point it'd be great to move to the last presentation of this evening before we go back into, or this afternoon actually, I'm also getting confused, before we go back into conversation and questions and answers. So if technology is working with us, then we will be having live with us Matica Kovac, the head of the Somalia Humanitarian Fund, to give us some perspectives on challenges and opportunities on how the Somalia Humanitarian Fund is able to work with and invest in organizational capacity and institutional capacity in the Somalia context, and specifically around assessments.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Mattia.
Hi, Matisha. I think I should be looking in that. Welcome. We can see you online. Thank you for joining us. Let's just test the audio. Could you just speak briefly and see if our audio is okay?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
We can't hear you. That might be our side.
I think that's an issue on your end. Hello, 1, 2, 3. Hello, 1, 2, 3.
You could bear with us. Could you try again?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Oh. Okay, so online, people can hear you.
1, 2,
it's just
3.
us in the room that can't.
One, 2, 3.
Oh, yes.
Ah, there you go. Now I cannot hear you, in case you can hear me.
First, Matica, how do you pronounce your name? First of all, let's start with that.
You pronounce it as Mattia.
Okay, so I've been making it more exotic than it is. Thank you for being with us. I think I'll hand over straight to you. Did you have some slides that you wanted to share your screen, or are you just going to?
Yes. So I'm already sharing those slides. I think someone who is managing this session needs to share them with everyone. I'm already sharing them. So you will actually see the slides and not me on the screen, which is probably better anyway. There you go. Okay, can I go?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry I can't be there with you, but I was asked to say a few words related to capacity assessment in the Somalia context or in the context of the Somalia Humanitarian Fund, which I will interchangeably link with also with some perspectives on capacity development and localization. First, a bit of a hint at the global perspective. In general, when it comes to country-based pool funds, the capacity support as such is really understood in the framework of what country-based pool funds have been and are doing within their mandate, which is essentially to support life-saving response, coordination, and leadership. And I think while on one hand, all funds are involved in support of the partner's capacity development or building through their processes that really address the fund's internal requirements related to allocations accountability, it is on the other hand quite fair to recognize that some do more of that than others, very much by the virtue of needs on the ground, but also based on internal strategic direction and really the capacity internally to support these activities. So I will speak a little bit more about Somalia, the setting within which I work, where I think, before we go into the issues related to capacity assessment, capacity development, and localization, it's really important to say a few words about the actual context. I mean, you heard a few things from Abdurrahman already, and you also have the gun there. But I think some of these points are important to re-emphasize, since they ultimately drive issues such as nature and modality of response, the role of local actors, but also need of capacity strengthening and development. So Somalia, as you know, protracted crisis, which is where the aid delivery as such is very NGO driven, and where it is very much sometimes also referred to as a business. It has severe security implications and access constraints, which at many locations, which very often plays in favor of local and national partners, which are very often the large mode of delivery to which the UN agencies, but also NGOs deliver their programs. But I think on the other hand, there's quite a lot of variety when it comes to local and national partners in terms of size, reach, affiliation, their financial and management capacity, cluster coverage, coordination, engagement, etc. I think a very important emphasis from this setting is that some NGOs, and you have representatives on some of those with you in the room, have been really leading the global localization drive and advocacy in the past. But against all this, there remains a very chronic and persistent lack of direct funding sources for local and national partners. So where do we fit in that when it comes to the Somalia Humanitarian Fund? Some numbers in front of you that really demonstrated we have, in terms of funding and interaction with partners, very much shifted towards working with non-governmental partners, including local and national, over the last few years. In that respect, our approach has supported, or one could also say resulted, in the support of the localization agenda. While we are very often referred to as the Localization Fund, our primary objective really remains to support best placed actors to implement in a timely, efficient, and accountable manner. And we have very much been focusing on direct implementation, really to ensure the value for money and maximum accountability of funds that we manage. This has been in the last few years paired with a very, very aggressive push from our end in financial oversight and accountability of activities, particularly since 2017 onwards, which I think it's a precondition and it's applicable to everyone. And I really want to emphasize, I think that's one of the most important points here. It's applicable to local, national, and international actors. And that has also resulted in a gradual expansion of the pool of eligible NGOs, where we have, for instance, in 2016, we had about 66 of those that were able to apply for funding, talking just about the non-governmental partners, including excluding UN agencies. We have reached approximately 120 at the moment, and these numbers are going up as we continue with the capacity assessment processes and the expansion of the pool. Now, in terms of capacity assessments in the Somalia case, Somalia, when it comes comparing to other country-based pool funds, is a bit of an outlier, and this process is heavier than in other funds. Now, heavy can mean more robust, but heavy can also mean more costly and slower. When it comes to the objective, the aim is really to ensure the effective and efficient fund management later down the line. For us, it's about getting to know partners as per our own internal criteria that really allows us to determine if and how we will work with these partners later on. And the standardized assessment process is really used to determine whether partners have institutional, managerial, and financial and technical capacity that is necessary to manage and implement the SHF projects. I think one important point to mention that is for us, the assessment is a starting point. It's a snapshot, if you want, that also allows to serve, that also serves to really identify capacity gaps that need to be addressed by the potential partner. It's a multi-step process where we clearly distinguish prioritization, separate prioritization for assessment and the actual assessment process. Prioritization is really based on operational needs. It's conducted by clusters where we really try to remove ourselves from that to the extent possible. While the actual assessment is then a two-step process where we do the pre-assessment, which is our own internal due diligence review, which really allows us to see whether we are dealing, essentially allows us to see whether we are dealing with a credible organization at that initial stage. We review registration documents, annual financial reports, external audited statements, documentation related to legal representatives of the organizations, etc. So compared to other country-based pool funds, that pre-assessment of ours is actually in many cases in other country-based pool funds the actual assessment. We then go a step further where the step 3, the actual assessment is conducted externally, and it's a detailed field-based capacity assessment, which is conducted by an independent external contractor, which then in that process visits at least 2 offices of the partner by applying a detailed globally based questionnaire, to which I'm going to come back a little bit later. And so the actual outcome of the assessment is, on one hand, determining the eligibility. Maybe let me start it differently. The first outcome is really a detailed report, which is shared with the partners, with a partner, which is essentially an outcome of a longer process where we work with a partner to go through. As I said, go through the assessment of certain institutional, managerial, financial, and technical capacities required. It allows us to determine the actual eligibility. Partners that pass the minimum threshold become eligible. And it allows us also, as a result, as a quantified result, determine the partner risk level, which is low, medium, or high. But I want to emphasize, this is not a done deal, if you want to put it that way. It's a dynamic score, which later on changes based on partners' performance. For instance, at every instance we formally interact with a partner, whether that being review of reports, monitoring, spot check, auditors, or audits, that score is further assigned. There's a score assigned that really impacts the partner performer indicators that then further determine their risk level. In the last few years, there's been quite a few changes introduced in this process. One has been that we have really are making it a multi-step process, which with placing more emphasis on a pre-assessment would actually allow us to speed up the process and determine at an early stage what kind of partner we are dealing with. We're working closer with other UN partners. I think that's a very, very important point, where a lot of these assessments that are coming out are shared with other UN agencies, but there's also synchronization in terms of methodologies, questionnaires used, etc. Driven by, I would say, several factors. One being we understand that capacity assessments as such are quite burdensome for partners. So there's definitely room for UN agencies to work closer on that. On the other hand, it also allows us to reduce resources necessary or use those resources better in terms of being able to really process and prioritize more partners for assessments. Now, how does this all, when it comes particularly to assessment, ties into the capacity support activities? As I said before, assessment for us is a starting point. It's often the first interaction with a partner. It's a thorough multi-step exchange, and results are discussed before the actual issuance of the final report. And by the time of finalization, we see that very often many issues that are raised are often already addressed. I think it's important to understand that these broader capacity development or capacity support efforts are really embedded within the broader fund management processes. The partners that become eligible commit to address weaknesses that are observed in the assessment, which we then follow up through the engagement with a partner. Then the whole SHF allocation processes through strategic and technical review allows us to have a lot of interaction, provide comments to partners for them to improve the quality of their projects. I think one a very, very important sort of emphasis, though, over the last few years have really been the fund's assurance activities that have been very much also geared towards further strengthening partners' capacity. Throughout our processes, such as particularly monitoring, field visits, financial spot checks, and audits, we really have been investing and putting a lot of time into providing feedback and working with partners on one-on-one basis, and treating the partner on a one-on-one or case-by-case basis. Now, to simplify, if there is an incompliance, or if there is no full if the partner is not fully meeting the criteria or standards that are set, that doesn't necessarily mean exclusion or blacklisting or anything like that. But it's for us a way to further work with a partner and really try to establish that link and one-on-one relationship, leading towards the partner at a later stage being able to meet some of those criteria. Another important point in that is really trainings, which are an important component that allow us to approach partner collectively and individually, not just before each allocation where we train them on project management cycle, etc., but really holding regular training sessions where enhancement areas include issues such as risk management, protection mainstreaming, participation of women in project lifecycle, etc. There are two points where really
sorry, just to come in, just in terms of process.
Okay, sorry, there was some noise in the back. Really 2 points for me to finish. I think one important shift has been that we have been trying to invest much more time in clearly laying our expectations, and that has been a crucial component of our investment of time over the last 2 years, particularly through the SHF operational manual and its annexes. Where we really try to be clear in terms of what are the standards that we require from partners, but through our processes also working with partners to help meet those standards. And a sort of last crucial point, I think, which I prefer to refer to when we talk about localization, is actually our approach of really going as direct as possible with the best placed partners. Going as direct as possible in Somalia context logically means that a lot of the delivery, where delivery is very much driven by local national partners, means that we do need to invest and we need to work closely with these partners. So going as direct as possible has been enshrined in our annual and specific allocation principles. Basically, we are discouraging subcost contracting and pass-through arrangements unless those arrangements really add value. For example, if partner is eligible to receive funding, they shouldn't be a subcontractee of another partner. We see that really direct implementation allows us invest directly in our partners. It allows us to invest our time with a partner, which I think it's essential. And at the end of the day, if you want, in terms of numbers and money, working as directly as possible with local and national partners also allows us to invest the 7% program support costs, which are attached to every single grant that goes out directly to the partner. It's an important seed funding for the organizational and capacity development of partners, and many of partners have actually confirmed this, over the years. So I will stop here, and yeah, happy to interact further.
Great, thank you, Mattia.
Okay. What do we do now?
I think it'd be very interesting to ask him a couple of questions, but if we can't get through to him, that's a bit difficult.
Why don't we type the questions?
Type the questions. Yeah, wait, can you hear us? Okay, great. Thank you for that contribution. I was trying to step in a few times in terms of time management, but I wasn't able to. And we have an echo. So thank you for all those contributions, very detailed. One thing I was wondering, if people want to know more about how the Somalia Humanitarian Fund is managing all these different elements that you have spoken about, are there other resources that could be looked into? That is one. Another question that I think came to mind. Sorry, there's lots of echo. Another question that came to mind is the assessments. You spoke about the thorough due diligence and assessment support that a process that local organizations go through, local partners go through, and then everything that they receive in return. I was just wondering, NGOs are also recipients of the fund. Do you apply the same assessment process to NGOs as you do to local and national NGOs? I don't know if you caught that question. Yeah, and maybe a last one, and then let's open it up also for reflection. Is our local and national NGOs, and we can ask that to Degan, of course, as well, are they able to gain unrestricted funding, flexible funding from the Somalia Humanitarian Fund to be able to invest in their organizational strengthening, institutional strengthening beyond particular project delivery? So I think you may have touched upon that, but those are three questions that came to mind to start us off. Now let's see.
Hello, can you hear me? Perfect. Yes. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Okay, the first one, yeah, so we'll share some additional information. I think a lot of these things are quite clearly written in the operational manual, annexes, where, as I said, we've put quite a lot of emphasis into clearly communicating to stakeholders across the country, national or international, about our own internal processes. And we have seen that, you know, the more we invest in that, the more there is understanding, but the more partners can do ahead to actually prepare themselves, not for the assessment processes, to lobby for their prioritization, but also to actually see what are the standards that are required, which are not, I would say, which shouldn't be seen in isolation, because at the end of the day, these are the standards that are very much applied by other donors, or would be applied by other donors bilaterally. So with meeting some of those standards and passing some of these assessment of ours, the actual likelihood of the partner to be able to approach and receive funding from other donors drastically increases. The answer to the second question, yes. This is applied universally across all non-governmental partners. It doesn't matter whether you are a national or an international partner, you will have to go through the exactly same scrutiny. That doesn't mean that we are more or less lenient towards anyone, and I can tell you, we have cases where we have international partners that don't pass. We have cases where we have international partners that get very low scores on the assessment, that are assessed as either high risk, etc. So, we make sure that the threshold is set to the extent that it is not too low, but that it also allows us to really work with a partner later on to support through the process with enhancement of their capacity and internal systems to, as I said, meet some of the expectations from our end. In terms of access to unrestricted funding, the country-based pool funds, unfortunately, or fortunately, the way they are structured, they're really geared towards supporting life-saving response directly. So most of the funding that is being allocated is allocated in accordance with allocation strategies that support direct response. However, I would say within a lot of those allocations, within a lot of those projects, there is definitely flexibility where we leave enough, I would say, wiggle room to support partners, not just over projects of, I don't know, a few $1,000s over the period of a few weeks or a few months, but we do increasingly encourage, regardless of the partner type, longer projects which go up to 12 or even lately up to 18 months, where partners are allowed, again, regardless of their type, to budget across their organizational needs. And I will revert once again to the last point from our implementation, from my presentation. The fact that we go and try to support response directly as possible really allows us to ensure that the 7% program support cost, which is if you want a very flexible funding for partners, and the fact is that when it comes to international partners, very often this program support costs are channeled further to HQ, but that's not necessarily the case when it comes to local and national partners. It gives them some room for internal capacity development and investment. Of course, it's not enough, but I think it's a good start. Now, I mean, there's a flip side to that as well. 7% is really unrestricted, and we never ask, at least formally in audits, etc., how that money has been spent. We do ask informally through trainings, etc. We get certain answers, but that's not something that we have the ability to verify at this stage.
If there's any particular question. Open up the floor.
Thank you. My name is Sara Dahl. I'm from Södertörn, Sweden. I was listening now to the presentation, and I was thinking, where or how do you work to increase the ownership of the organizations, your partners themselves, to do their own assessments of their capacity in order to strengthen both accountability, but also in itself strengthen the capacity of those organizations?
And maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more questions, and then you can take them together. Is this working? Are you hearing us online, Matia? Yeah.
My name is Kirsten from ActionAid. I was wondering, this is a question for Abdirahman. From listening to Matia, I was thinking that the investment in capacity, let's just accept that term for now, Matia said was heavy. It's a long-term investment. And I'm wondering, and it actually sounds a lot like a lot of NGOs are also working to build capacity of local organizations. Again, accepting that that's a widely used language. So I'm just wondering, does it feel different? Who's supporting or assessing capacity? NGOs or the country-based pool fund?
Are there any more for now? Should we start with these 2? Okay, maybe we can start with Abdirahman. So this last question, does it feel any different?
The capacity.
In how capacity assessment is done. So when you work with, when you become a partner, or when you partner with an NGO for particular response or humanitarian programming work, and the NGO comes with its whole process of assessment and due diligence, etc. Does it feel different than when you work with the Somalia country-based pooled fund and the processes that they have? Is there just a question around your experience? Is it different, and what's maybe different in both sides?
I think, yes, we experience mainly differences when we are talking about the assessments that are undertaken by the different NGOs. Maybe SHF, and UN has its own assessments, maybe. The other might be SAFE or ActionAid or UNICEF can be having their own assessments. So sometimes it will be create confusions, but as more the NGOs become more mature or have an experience, it can grow with all that assessments or that due diligences, but still it would be better to harmonize all that assessments. I don't know, every country and every donor has its own policies, but it would be better when, as a poor fund country and as a Somalia, I think it would be very useful to harmonize all that assessments and at least set minimum standards that can the local actors to be passed, then allow them to be eligible for the NGOs or the UN or SHF funds. So this is very important, really an issue, and as all actors, local actors and international NGOs and UN, and it would be better to address together and to harmonize our assessments and our requirements so as to make the process of inheritance, the humanitarian interventions in Somalia for the local partners. It's very important to harmonize all our efforts in terms of the capacity assessments and the other requirements.
Thank you. There's one other question added on, but Mattia, there was a question put to you. If you could respond to that first question.
Yeah, sorry, I had a little bit of trouble actually hearing the first question. So could you very briefly repeat it? I'm sorry.
Now it's back on. Oh, now it gets. Okay, Mattia, can you hear me now? Okay, great. So my name is Sara Dahl. I'm from Save the Children Sweden, and I was wondering, in order to in relation to the localization agenda to transfer responsibility, accountability, etc., to local actors, I was wondering, in what way are you also involving these organizations' own self-assessment, or how can you, because it sounds like still it's the fund that assesses potential partners, but at what stage are these partners or organizations also assessing themselves, and how are those results taken into account in your future partnership?
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I think that's actually quite a good question. I think in principle, we welcome any kind of communication and input we receive from partners where they're able to demonstrate how they're, if you want, improving on areas that are of interest of us or that we look into when we perform assessments. I think one thing that would be, very welcome in this particular setting would be if there was a little bit more of internal synchronization among the partners, or a little bit more cohesion in terms of them coming up with certain criteria, etc. And I think there are several players that can play an important role with that, from the NGO steering committee or any kind of other formal or informal networks. But I mean, my answer to that would be that, in principle, at any point in time when we would receive credible information, supported through I don't know, documentation provided by the partner that demonstrates some of the internal assessments and results coming out of it, we welcome that. And I would say in a case that's actually done through us requesting or requiring that they do follow certain standards, such as and for instance, talking particularly at the time of pre-assessment, so that's at the time before we assess them, before they become eligible, is we request audited statements, etc. And I have to admit that at the beginning this was something that was a little bit of a shock to some partners, because we were going so thoroughly in requesting some of these things prior to actually conducting an assessment. But in a sense, it became a bit of a standard, and partners are now they know in advance that this is something that they'll be for example, requested to provide, which I think it's in itself is a positive development, because it's a standard, or it could be seen as a standard of the industry, or any kind of businesses to, for instance, ensure that as a partner, whether big or small, you have audited financial statements at the beginning of the year, which really allow you to demonstrate externally how transparently or how not or demonstrate certain transparency in terms of how you're spending money, where the money is going, etc. So I would say, in short, it is very welcome. I think we indirectly do it, but not to the extent that there would be a set up self-assessment system in this particular setting.
The stage as well, there's a lot of, and if you have a little bit of more energy left, even the very pregnant one. Zigan, could I invite you back up, and Jill and John? And there's a couple of questions around donors that I think are really interesting to put to the panel. So there's, especially online, and I hope our listeners are still online. Thank you for all the questions that you put forward. But there was some questions around, I guess, a little bit of disillusionment. What's the rhetoric versus the reality? And so then I think that's an interesting one to put forward. So one of the issues put forward is that more and more INGOs are registering nationally. It's been raised before, of course. And instead of kind of shifting the power, they're merely shifting registration, whereas the people that are still kind of doing the operational work are often internationals or INGO staff rather than the local partners. So shifting registration instead of shifting power, what say ye? But also another challenge from the group online was, but what about when capacity of local organizations has been strengthened and they are able to access the funds, and all of this has worked, but the attitude of INGOs stay the same. Do you have any suggestions on tackling that challenge? So I'm just going to put that one there for whoever feels called to maybe reflect on it. Another question is specifically around clusters. You mentioned clusters, Mattia, but we haven't mentioned it very much in our work today. And working groups, humanitarian working groups. So what could they do differently to strengthen the localization process and involvement of local actors? There's some colleagues, of course, and organizations are actively involved in cluster systems. Do you have any tips, suggestions, recommendations, or urgent things to do for these mechanisms to strengthen the localization process? Another question, just putting it out there, is what are the donors saying? How are the donors actually relating to this? Maybe also reality versus rhetoric. Are they de-risking? Are they actually moving towards direct support to local actors? So that was just a little cluster of really interesting conversations, I thought, around donors and INGOs, rhetoric versus reality. So I don't know who I might give who feels compelled to contribute their reflections first. John, great.
Thank you. I hope after me, others will come. Oh, sorry.
It doesn't sound like it's on, but is it working online? Are people hearing us?
I think mainly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to talk about the adherence of INGOs, even when we have registered, even when we have capacity and everything. A case scenario in Uganda was that even when the local NGOs got capacity, it was still hard for them to engage. And if I can remember, the government played a role in that as well. The government at the district level, they influence a lot. First of all, the people who give money to these INGOs, that's of course the government to government conversations. And then again, of course, also talking as the host country government, assuring the INGOs of the safety, the documentation they already received with these local NGOs, because that is where the fear is. Of course, if we give them the money, are they taking up our space? Are we going to implement or what? So from Uganda, the government really did a lot of advocacy for these UN agencies to fund. I remember two local organizations who were funded by UNHCR directly, was a direct influence of the government. And because they had the assurance, they did their own assessment as well as the host country. So if the government can have this discussion at a higher level of assuring the INGOs that yes, they can go ahead and give this support to the local organizations, I think it will be more, they will have more confidence to respond. Because the fear is not that they don't now trust. They know you have everything, but maybe the policies from whoever is giving the money. If they don't have that assurance that yes, you can go ahead and have a co-applicant or implement through a local organization, then it won't work. I can tell the colleague who is online that there are times where you are engaged, but you don't appear in the final report. Why? You have done the activity, you've done everything, but you can't find your visibility. You go to the website of whichever organization that helped you, you can't find you being mentioned or being credited for. Why? So that is, it's a long chain. It's not about just implementing, it's about committing as an INGO together with the donor that yes, we are confident about this partner and that we can go a long way with them. And that will do a lot with giving credit, writing together the report, all of you appearing there, and then at a certain point, letting you go to actually do the activity more than the INGO.
Anyone else? Rhetoric versus reality. What could the cluster system do? The working groups. Mattia?
All right, perfect. Can you hear me? Yes. 3 points. I think first on the attitude of international partners. I think let's put it like this. competition helps. And in this setting, sometimes it's important to, it's not just about fair competition, but it requires quite a lot of affirmative action in order to reach the stage where local and international partners, local and national partners can compete sort of semi-fairly. And I think when that starts happening and more we see that, I think also the attitude of international partners in the country start changing. On the clusters, I think there's a great role that the cluster system can play to further the localization agenda. Very much we see that we have intercluster groups functioning relatively well on the national level. However, as you go more down toward localities or regions, really depends depending on the setting, that is less of a case. What we have been trying to do really more over the last year and a half has been trying to involve regional cluster structures, regional ICCGs into the allocation processes, into the prioritization processes. And in a way, we have seen that the more local we go in that respect, better engagement of local partners, which very often play a role as a regional, or local cluster lead, or supporting specific clusters in that area. The more we really try to enforce or we promote this bottoms-up approach, the more of buy-in and the more of engagement we can get, or more and more inclusive engagement of local partners we get. It's far from ideal, but I think it's an important starting point. And maybe just last point on visibility. I'm not responding directly to my colleague because I would say we don't have that much of a problem because we fund directly. And when we fund directly, we are quite proud and happy to elevate the visibility of partners. It doesn't matter whether they're local, national, or international. I think we try to go even a step further, that we try to see the visibility as a way to promote the work, their own work, their approach to their solutions. But ensuring visibility is also a vehicle for us to enhance accountability. It's very helpful to use social media and promote work of partners, because one thing is to post photos how great you are in doing your work, but very quickly you can also find those following you who start questioning your work, and I think very often that is helpful.
Final reflections to Digan. And then if after Digan has spoken, just to ask you to think about what is one of your main takeaway, maybe, to get a few contributions, 4 or 5 from the audience. What are the main takeaways that you've taken from this session today? I think that would be really interesting for the organizers, as well as for us, kind of as a bit of a wrap up. What are we taking home into our own organizations, into our own practice? One other thing that a colleague mentioned here is, this is the second out of a series of 4 workshops sponsored by the Danish government. And so if you have ideas on what are the other issues around localization that you feel need more in-depth exploration with guests and jointly together, then do come forward with ideas and suggestions and send them to the email of the organizer, Maria, that you also used to register for this event. So that's just a little bit of housekeeping and keeping you, and hopefully keeping you here for another 5 minutes, as I hand over to Digan for reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. So I just have to first acknowledge Mattia by saying, I think that in many ways the country-based pooled funds, and at least in Somalia, we have seen that the SHF have been really some of the most progressive financing mechanisms for local actors, and they are doing, and where they were 5-10 years ago and where they are now is dramatically different. So definitely we appreciate that, we acknowledge that, and we see that the SHF in Somalia is definitely trying to fund more and more local actors. And really the reality is, it's the only financing mechanism that exists in the humanitarian system for local actors to get direct funding. So it does serve that purpose in many ways. Recognizing that, I would like to make a few comments. the whole conversation, okay, first, one, the clusters. I think it was only the protection cluster, if remind me or correct me if I'm wrong, Mattia, that had a global co-chair who was a local NGO. It's the only one. And I think that needs to, and that was Halima, and that only lasted for about a year. And I don't think that currently is the case. I could be wrong. I'm not sure if they replaced her with another local NGO. But there's something wrong with that. Why is it that UNICEF and an INGO are always the leads for WASH? Adesso pioneered cash. Majority of the food security funding goes to cash programs. Why is it that organizations like Adesso and others are not leading on at the national level on cash and the food security cluster? So I think there has to be more change at the national level, not only at the district or regional levels in terms of the cluster positions. I think the competition does help, and I think the SHF might be one of the few models of healthy competition where INGOs and locals have competed under a fairly, fair setup, equal setup, and locals have won. That's true. I completely agree with that. But I also think that it's not fully fair level playing field, because one of the criteria for being assessed and getting the money for the SHF is value for money. So what happens, oftentimes local NGOs lose out on the value for money marker because INGOs can subsidize their operational costs on those projects, almost charge no staff costs, almost charge no rental cost of offices, no vehicle costs, because they have big money from OFDA or ECHO or other big donors who are subsidizing that in those same project areas. And that's what they do. They use the SHF money to really leverage money that they get from other donors. That's what they will never go to a particular area 100% using the SHF money. You will rarely ever see that they will work only in those locations or those projects, those communities only with SHF money. Whereas local NGOs, that's what they're using. They're using only SHF money. So, so I think that is an area that has to be removed. How fair is that competition in recognition of that? Last point I would like to make is about solidarity. If INGOs are serious about localization, since this is the only facility that currently exists, we would like to create other facilities that are more dynamic, that do more things around flexible funding, core funding, capacity investment or institutional investment, all of these things that leverage diaspora funding and match giving and all these more innovative things that the SHF was not designed for. It was not meant to do that. But in lieu of that, in lieu of those new infrastructure being available, why don't INGOs in Somalia, in Syria say that we will not apply for the SHF? And we don't want it to be accessible to INGOs any longer. We want all of our 20–30% of that pie or whatever it was to go to local actors. That will also force UN to reflect. Why is it that the UN accesses SURF and the SHF? You know, those are, there's on top of the other bilateral money that they're getting, direct funding that they're getting. We know that in the humanitarian aid system, 60–70% of the funding already goes to the UN system. So why is it that they're accessing the country-based pool funds? But I think we have to start with our civil society partners. If we are serious about being civil society partners, then this is where there's an opportunity for solidarity.
Great. Thank you very much. And so at this point, oh, Mattia, did you want to make a comment? We have run out of time for this event, so if you can keep it brief. Can we hear you?
Yeah, thanks. Just very quickly, I in principle agree with all of Degan's points, and I think, yeah, we definitely need to do more to support inclusion of local national partners in the cluster coordination system. That's going to allow them to come closer to the decision making, not just with pool funds, but in general in humanitarian response. On the second point you raised, which I would call like a price dumping from the side of NGOs, I think that may have been the case more in the past. At least on our end, we see less and less of that. NGOs are quite willing to actually ask for quite a lot of support costs through our funding. On the solidarity part, yeah, I mean, I think there, we need to balance it with the fact that when it comes to country-based pool funds, one of the comparative advantages is really the flexibility. So I think it's about really juggling those priorities. I mean, the way we've gone about it is really trying to prioritize and push as much as possible for direct implementation. I would say there's definitely room to do more of that, but I would say in other funds, yeah, there's probably much more room to do that. Thanks.
Before we close, anybody who wants to just share a brief reflection, what is the one thing that you're going to take home? What is the one thing that surprised you that you hadn't heard before from today's session? There's anybody that would like to raise their hand and offer a reflection? Thank you.
I think that I'm Elsa and I'm from Oxfam Nevis. I think the idea of just swap was really good, and I think that's an idea that should maybe be used more than the team. And then also one other thing, I think it's very important to think about that the local actors are there, so that's not the problem. So the problem is maybe more us, how do we align?
Thank you.
I like the discussion on the terminology and the fact that the word capacity somehow is so loaded, and I wonder how we can change that. And the other thing which I think is loaded with capacity assessment is that we always look for gaps, and we don't build into those assessment forms where we see where there's complementary roles, where there are strengths that where we complement each other as development actors. So I think those were things that I will take home and think more about.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy to hear the discussion around institutional investment. That is what is coming through the human-led organizations, human rights organizations. Are we ready to invest in their aspirations alongside the work in humanitarian action as INGO partners and variety partners? Are we willing to stand with them some of the aspirations that can help them take their work even further than what project funding is able to do for them?
Thank you very much. Do I see any more raised hands?
I'm Liana from Dignity, the Institute of Soldier. To be frank, I mean, I'm going home a bit more frustrated about the solutions that I've already voiced before. And this is a great discussion. That next time, or maybe if it's possible, I would like to hear also more about discuss more about the humanitarian development nexus. Something that's increasingly confusing. But maybe we did it already.
Thanks. Great. Thank you very much. Is that closing? Any final reflections from the speakers? What is your takeaways? John, put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Okay. To me, I think I'm trying to learn that there are people also who are sitting here at a very high level, but they are thinking the same way we've been thinking, that we need to shift the power and we need to look at local organizations as development partners, not just people who give money to implement our activities, but actually people that we care and we feel they do the same work and make the same impact like us. So it's great that I've been here, and I think I'm taking back a message of hope that this discussion doesn't end here. I hope you go to your individual organizations and really put it into paper, because I'll be happy that I hear this discussion happen one time or many times, even not here, but at the local level as well. But it is so encouraging, and I think it's an eye-opener for me to see group of people, powerful organizations trying to push for the same policy change. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you to everybody in the room. Thank you to the organizers for making this happen and bringing everybody together like this. Thank you for everybody online for sticking with us despite some technical difficulties. Thank you to the technical support. And yeah, just wishing you a great day and follow up to this conversation in your own organizations, but also at the next event. So hope to see you there. Thank you.